and opportunities for using devices for data collection for clinical trials, and hopefully impart to you why standardization for wearables and sensors is really going to be the key to their acceptance and usage. The clinical trial system has a lot of problems, and the first slide here was given to me by Becky Cush, and I learned the term swivel chair technology, which is where people move from proprietary pharma company laptop to enter data for clinical trials. And the middle picture is a picture of a handwritten notebook of a patient of ours on a children's oncology group trial. And this is actually how we record our adverse events. Still, this is done by hand in a lot of cases. The clipboard, I think, is emblematic of our problem still, where much data are either collected via paper or even in forms that are electronic but still have to be transcribed. And of course, the obligatory silo picture that has to be part of every one of these talks. I think a good example of this is sleep data. So the way that we ask people about their sleep on a clinical trial is we ask them to fill out a survey every 2 weeks called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, which looks over the last 2 weeks and asks them how they slept. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not the best historian when it comes to how I slept last night, let alone over the last 2 weeks. So you can imagine that these data can be suspicious. And if you have a study where sleep is an important quality of life metric, and you're collecting data on sleep every 2 weeks through a survey, you can imagine that would lead to unreliable data. Bad data, of course, lead to waste. You've seen the new data from Tufts that it's about $2.5 billion now to bring a new drug to market, and that's been increasing every decade. These numbers, I think, are startling. These are the transition rates from phase 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. And I think our ability to make these go and no-go decisions for these different phases is largely, in a large way, affected by the quality of the data that we're collecting through these antiquated and arcane systems. So I believe there's a better way, and I think all of us would agree that the quantified self movement has really ushered in this age of different ways to measure things and measure ourselves and things around us. Of course, this is tongue-in-cheek, this narcissistic attitude, but let's face it, everybody is using a wearable or their cell phone in some way to track themselves, and some people go as far as to publish their step counts and their running maps on Facebook and other places. So this is an important movement, and there's been no end to the wearables and sensors that we see now in all walks of life, and anything that you might want to measure can be measured and then reported. Mobile health is everywhere. There's hundreds of thousands of mobile health apps in the different iOS and Android stores. There's going to be hundreds of millions of wearables shipped in the next couple of years, with 6 billion smartphones by 2020, and a multi-billion-dollar clinical-grade wearables market. So this is a really important area that we need to drive forward, and I'm hoping to show you some of the ways we can do that. Wearable data are, of course, more reliable. They're better quality. They're better than trying to have somebody remember what they did. People tend to underreport their activities if they walk to work or if they go running. There should be a more transparent audit trail. We should be able to track better where the data are coming from when it's reported automatically through a wearable or a sensor. Patients should have reduced burden of having to fill out their diaries if we can transition diaries and surveys to something that's passive. And ultimately, we can increase patient engagement by creating this ecosystem where patients invest themselves in an app or in a community of people using an app and collecting their data via sensor or wearable. So there's a lot of concerns about device accuracy, and the popular press doesn't help. This was a publication, or this was, I don't want to call it a publication. This was a piece from a couple of years ago where this guy basically slapped a bunch of wearables on himself and walked around for a mile and published the data. And published, wow, look how inaccurate these data are. And of course he said, I underlined it there, this is not a scientific test. Well, of course it's not a scientific test, but of course everybody picks this up and reports this. Well, here's the scientific test, and I wish I had thought of this, because it'd be a great way to get a JAMA paper. So they, again, slapped a bunch of wearables and sensors on a bunch of researchers and had them walk on a treadmill, and then reported out the variance in the data collection. And so, of course, when there's, they took basically what the other guy did, and they actually applied some science to it and got themselves a research letter in JAMA. And listen, what all these things say are that the data are variable, and each device isn't perfect. So we wrote a little piece about this in 2016 and said, of course the data aren't perfect. We know that. That's not the issue. The issue is, can you understand in which ways the data aren't perfect? Can you model the data? Can you understand if somebody gave it to their dog to wear, or somebody didn't wear it for 2 days, or they switched right arm to left arm? That's what we have to understand. We don't have to try to prove that Fitbit is 10% better than Garmin. We just need to understand in which ways the data differ. There's, of course, other concerns about wearables, and I have a much longer talk where I boringly delve into each of these. But privacy and security of data is, of course, an issue, and there's been numerous studies showing that the consumer wearable companies do not take the privacy of your data very seriously, and this needs to be addressed. Data provenance is a huge issue right now because the wearables that are consumer grade do not have a good way to track wearable IDs and understand how the data move through the data pipeline, and this has to be solved. We have to have good data lineage if we hope to use wearables for clinical trials. We have to be able to blind users to the results when it's appropriate. If somebody's on a continuous glucose monitor trial and it's important to not have them see their continuous glucose readout all the time, you have to be able to work with the device to make sure that it's not showing the user except when you want it to. So Garmin, for instance, has an application software development kit where you can actually modify the firmware on their devices so that you can only show the user what you want them to see. And I think one of the biggest issues is just the opaque algorithms we have right now. So when you collect Fitbit data, as you know, it goes to your cell phone, and your cell phone goes to Fitbit servers, and then you have to go to Fitbit servers and download the data. You have no idea how it's been transformed. You have no idea what was left on the device or not left on the device. And this is a huge issue that needs to be addressed. There are some manufacturers now, I've heard that the Apple iWatch will let you actually download the accelerometer data right from the watch itself, and this needs to be something that pervades the industry before we can really start using these data effectively. The FDA, as you heard this morning, is quite bullish on wearables, and I think they're waiting for more and more studies to come forward that use wearables and that potentially use endpoints that are based on wearables. There's been a risk-based approach that's been advocated by the FDA with some cautious optimism, I like that term, and that any devices you use have to be fit for purpose. So if you're going to monitor sleep, you should use a device that was designed to measure sleep. And there's a new digital health innovation plan that is emerging. So I'm not going to say too much more about the FDA, mainly because I don't know a lot more about where their position is, but just to say that I don't think the FDA should be seen as an impediment. I think they're excited about bringing these studies forward. Okay, so wearables, I think, hopefully everyone in the room agrees, ultimately can make clinical trials better, faster, and cheaper. And so we're doing this today at University of Chicago. We have a study going with our gastrointestinal disease research group for patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And what we're doing is we're taking patients that have IBD, that normally fill out an IBD scale. They fill out a sleep survey every 2 weeks, like I described. They talk about their they fill out activity surveys, and now what we're doing is we're giving them Fitbits, we're collecting Fitbit data, and we're doing this correlation to show that the passive data collection is going to be as good, hopefully better, than the traditional metrics for measuring these things. So ultimately, when you want to conduct a research study, you can record something like sleep passively, and then the data will actually reflect what happened to the patient, not relying on their recall to do this. You have to have an app, of course, so the apps in many ways are commoditized, but of course, having an app gets people into the ecosystem. I think it's important. The app that Litmus is using is able to spin up very quickly different surveys, ask the patient daily, how are you feeling, how did you sleep last night, can spin up these specific surveys for inflammatory bowel disease. We use them to ask this sleep quality index questions, and then it allows you to connect to a Fitbit in this case, which they're given as part of the study. One of the things I think is really important is trying to understand the difference between the data science part and the data engineering part. And I think for us, we're really excited about the engineering part, that we should be device agnostic, connect to any device, and then we should really be able to connect to any patient-reported outcome measure that's out there. So if there's a survey, a promise measure, there's a catalog of surveys, we should be able to connect to those things and use those data, regardless of what the device is or what the survey is. We love showing investigators statistics about both the population, how are people doing in the study, how far along are they, and then individual patient progress, who's not wearing their Fitbit, who forgot to charge it, who didn't put it on, so that they can reach out to the patient in a very quick way and try to figure out what's going on. So I mentioned before that I think normalization and standardization are key. We have to be able to model the baseline error of the data that are collected. We have to have standards to ensure interoperability, and there's a lot of talk of standardization for all types of clinical data, and the mobile world is starting to catch up through things like the Mobile Health Consortium and other groups. Mobile data must be fair, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I changed my slide this morning when I heard this awesome quote by Janet Woodcock saying that data should be collected in a way that's robust by design and intent and not by quality control. That's fantastic. So I think these are all ways that we're going to help use mobile data for trials. Just a few notes on why the sum here is really important. So if you have sleep, what we're doing is we're collecting survey data for sleep, and then we're combining it with the passive sleep data to try to corroborate. But imagine now you could do things like collect GPS data in addition to step data, and do things like say, well, the patient said they walked 10,000 steps, but they didn't leave their house. So what does that mean? Or the patient said they said that their GPS shows they didn't leave the house and they walked 40,000 steps. Those things don't go together. So I think we'll be able to start to do some corroboration on different types of data. The analytics are important, like I mentioned, corroborating these types of metrics, but I think for us, we're really excited about time series modeling. So how can you do things like even predict flares and predict problems that patients have by starting to use other sensors? Defining endpoints is important. We talk about how did the patient sleep? What does that mean? Is that the number of times they woke up? Is it the number of times they rolled over? Is it some magical sleep quality number that we have to come up with? I think this is important before we move forward. And then ultimately creating new measures of quality of life. This, I think, is the real key. What does it mean for somebody with Crohn's or with arthritis or with lupus to feel better? That's a difficult concept, and I think as we collect more and more wearable, environmental, and patient-reported data, we can start to redefine these quality of life measures. And I think quality of life is the ultimate endpoint. I like to think the whole world is a clinical trial. We're going to be measuring and taking in data and sensor data from many different places and being able to connect that with all sorts of different data that we collect in our everyday lives. This used to be my longevity slide, the birthday cake with 100 candles on it. And I don't think it's the best metaphor anymore. I think, of course, we want to live longer, but I think by using these tools, we can actually learn about living better. And here's a guy who's 106 now who just ran a marathon when he turned 100. So that's, you want to live to 100, but you want to be able to be healthy, and you want to be able to live out your years well. And I think that's the real key here. So bring it all together, I think wearables and sensors, smartphones are going to transform the clinical trials industry. I think there's plenty of valid concerns. I think they're all surmountable. The keys to success for me that I see are standardized data collection and normalization of the data with appropriate attention to privacy and security. So one more thing, at Litmus we spent a ton of time putting together a device census report that describes a couple dozen sensors in great detail and what the data they collect and how appropriate they are for different types of studies. If you just go on and log on and put that code in, we'd be happy to send you a copy of this report. That's my last slide, and I think I'm out of time, so I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker, I'm happy to introduce Stephen Arneric, right?
Perfect.
And Stephen's the executive director of the Coalition Against Major Diseases. He's a professor of research at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. And he's going to be talking about a case study of using biometric monitoring devices for assessing endpoints in clinical trials, developing an ecosystem. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Sam, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah. There. So the Critical Path Institute began in 2005 from the Critical Path Initiative from the FDA. It began with 2 consortia. Today it's 15 global consortia with interactions with a number of different organizations around the globe. I head the one on the critical path for Alzheimer's disease, so we recently changed our name, so we've rebranded to indicate where we would like to interface with our researchers. So the focus on data standards, clinical trial simulation, developing actionable databases which will lead to drug development tools and other biomarkers which can be used in clinical trials. Our clinical data represents about 107 different clinical trials across a number of different areas. We have a general expertise in degenerative diseases, in particular Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So that data set is continuing to grow. One of the things that we heard earlier today is informed consent is incredibly important, and a year ago we had an initiative to focus, at least for Alzheimer's disease, a very short informed consent, so basically a page and a half long, that could be quite intelligible and understandable to anybody in that particular field, whether it's the patient themselves or the caregiver. If you think about data access, informed consent is incredibly important. So if you want to build an understanding of disease progression and have access to the data across these different sources, you need the appropriate informed consent. So this allows one to build the science that can move the field forward. What we do is bring together different stakeholders, whether it's patients, pharma companies, different advocacy groups, academia, and government agencies. We try to understand disease progression and work towards developing some of the drug development tools that I'll talk about. We bring together different data sets and put it together in using data standards so it all speaks the same language, so you have a truly actionable data set. And then hopefully develop these different models and clinical trial simulation tools that will enable the identification of the right patients with all the appropriate aspects in consideration. If we think about biomarker development, these digital biomarkers are in a sense a biomarker development enterprise. It takes many years to develop these types of assessments. But one of the things that often gets overlooked is the regulatory dimensions of this. If you want it to be used in clinical trials, one needs to validate these different measures and bring them to the regulators. Here's a slide indicating some of the evidence that's really needed to qualify a biomarker or an assessment, such as one would use with these digital biomarkers. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but would point you to carefully read this and understand what's truly needed to bring something forward. Another slide that's lifted from an FDA presentation, fit for purpose. So one can think of different types of biomarkers, and there's these valuable assets which teach us how we can think about these different assessments. You can use these biomarkers for trial inclusion. You potentially could use it as a surrogate endpoint to really understand if disease progression as well as hopefully treatment responses. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. So CEMD was our name of origin for this particular consortium. We've delivered a number of regulatory drug development tools, including thanks to EMA as well as FDA. We've also devised various fit-for-purpose models, which I'll touch on in a moment. Here's an example of how data, when extracted from across a number of different trials, can really help you. And the question was, does one use a crossover design or a parallel design to most effectively assess Alzheimer's disease? And in this particular effect, it was 91 weeks in duration. We would require 600 patients. Didn't quite meet the power needed for the study. But if one used a parallel design, you could actually accomplish it much quicker. You could use half the number of patients, and you actually hit your power that you were desired to go forward. So taking these aggregated bits of data, you can learn a great deal. You can do more efficient trials, affect less individuals, exposing them to experimental drugs. In addition, one of the things that we did for Alzheimer's disease was to work with CDISCs to help develop the appropriate standards to move things forward. We had an initial set of standards. They were augmented in 2016 with things, the more contemporary CSF biomarkers, volumetric imaging, and PET ligands that are in the field to move the whole field forward. But you need the language and the framework to actually capture that information appropriately. I think the next generation of moving this field forward is to use these digital biomarkers and to collect them in an appropriate way. Another aspect, I think a majority of us would agree that consensus science is truly important in terms of moving the field forward. But here's an example of an article well done in terms of identifying a potential assessment for early Alzheimer's disease. But if one were to run a 2-year trial with this endpoint, bring it to the regulators, there's no standards for this, and all registration studies must use CDISC standards if you want something registered. So as we think about the end in mind, I think one of the things we often think about is the problems that we face today, but if we want to think about the future, we're going to have to solve some of these problems very quickly. So identifying these standards which can be used for registration trials, we're in the here and now, and that needs to be done. If you think about databases, there's so many consortia out there, and just looking at faster cures as a general assessment, only about 20% of the consortia out there actually have a database, and even smaller percentage of those share their data outside their consortia. So sharing data is going to be one of the ways in which we can move this field forward. Regulatory science, there's really only 2 consortia that focus, at least in the Alzheimer's cognition field, and that happens to be from the critical path. We have focused on developing clinical trial simulation models for mild to moderate disease, and it's been very helpful to the industry. We're focusing on the middle stages of the disease now, and we hope to work towards the pre-symptomatic stages for the future. Here's a little snapshot of how we've been able to impact globally different organizations. About half of them are from academia, the other half are from different pharmaceutical organizations, and clearly the major impact's been in the US, but we have had general global impact. Our future is, again, to look at the earlier stages, collecting data with instruments that are more sensitive, as you might imagine, with these digital assessments, and hopefully create a picture of what disease progression looks like at the earlier parts of the disease. The way to do that is through these biometric monitoring devices, which come in various forms. One rather simple is drug adherence. If without any sort of device, the average patient only takes their drugs 50% of the time. With a little encouragement from an app, it can go up to roughly 80%. And so the FDA has also recently approved a pill, which it's a device that acknowledges, yes, the pill was ingested, and so the patient is adherent. And a quote from the past is, drugs don't work in patients that don't take them. So Everett Koop, I mean, it's a simple comment, but it's so true. And I think from a payer's perspective, we have to also consider ways in which we can take this information and utilize it to provide better health care. So the Internet of Things is growing. It's expanding. Things like physiologic sensors for things like glucose monitors, other sorts of motion sensors and so on are continuing to grow. Here is some data from a colleague, that Jeff Kay at Oregon Health Sciences University. It's a little complex, but on the top is midnight, on the bottom is noon. We're looking at a patient, and you can see as you move between midnight and so on, there's very little movement. You can see the bedroom, kitchen, and so on. Here's the same patient a little over a year later. In the middle, you can see that their activity dramatically changed. They're up during the night quite a bit. Their whole pattern of activity of daily living is disrupted dramatically. With treatment, you have a somewhat normalized but not complete restoration of activities towards normal. So this is the profound way in which these devices can change our assessments in a quantitative way. It can do it in a preemptive way if one monitors it chronically. Here's a data set, again shared. This is real data from a study. The top patient looks like they're progressing rapidly. But the reality is that's the stable patient. It's this patient here that when you do vector analysis over time, it changes rapidly, and it really heightens the awareness that we can't look at clinical trials in the snapshots that we're used to on a quarterly basis, but if we could understand individual patient data over time, you would truly understand who's progressing, who's not. I'm going to go quickly through this and just say the FDA is really acknowledging the field and moving it forward. There's a lot of different entities out there that are starting to support the activities needed to really create this ecosystem. Compliance is a big one. On the right-hand side, you can see drug adherence, and those who are cognitively impaired are dramatically decreased. So they don't take their meds on time. They don't often do that. So if you think about healthcare, and the average patient is on a dozen medications when they're over 65, how's that going to impact health? So here's low-hanging fruit in terms of understanding how we can understand the patient and what we can do to improve healthcare in general. Here's just two other assessments, simple computer use. You can show dramatically on the left that it goes down as a patient moves towards mild cognitive impairment, and also their ability to get out and move around the community. Here's one of the things that should get your attention. So if we think about the frequency of data collection and computer use, walking speeds that are assessed, compared to simple delayed memory recall, which is a standard assessment of memory, you can take a $400 million trial and potentially reduce it to $60 million, and the time required to actually see these changes are dramatically smaller. So integrating this into how we do things is incredibly important. One of the things we hope to do as a consortium is to take global, actionable, standardized, and anonymized data from clinical trials, observational studies, healthy aging groups, eventually e-health records. I think that's going to be a little bit down the road. We're not quite there. Try to see how that provides us an understanding of disease progression, collaborate with the Global Alzheimer's Association Interactive Network, and to create for the scientific community these sandboxes of analytics in which one can go in there and really try to tease out what is happening with time. Challenges for the future are, again, going to be data availability and what are the standards that are going to be used. I'm not going to talk through this. The different types of signs that may be useful in terms of, I agree completely with Sam in terms of the idea about activities of daily living being an important area. It's one of the things that the recent FDA guidance on, at least for Alzheimer's disease, is really, that's going to be one of the things that's truly important as a measurement. It's an assessment of cognition if you can carry out all your instrumental activities of daily living. Surrogate endpoints, everybody likes to talk about them. They're not simple to demonstrate. Hemoglobin A1C and tumor size are two things that have been looked at in the area. For Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration in general, an emerging one is neurofilament light. It's a marker from CSF as well as plasma. The studies in red, these are published data that, in fact, all these things change there. There's probably some other articles I missed in these other areas. Multiple sclerosis, it's the first marker that's actually shown with treatment. It normalizes the response. So it's a potential biomarker that you could pair with your digital biomarkers and other sorts of assessments to give confidence that you can pick the right patients and you can actually see treatment responses for the future. Most of these neurodegenerative diseases have a lot of common features, effects on cognition, effects on mobility, effects on sleep. So all these dimensions in the future are going to be really important, and clearly they can impact how we live out our lives. The benefits of these different, there's a lot of words here, but fundamentally it boils down to this frequent assessment will allow one to understand safety hazards quickly. It allow one to take this multiple data sets and hopefully transform them into a drug development tool that the regulators will embrace to move things forward, but we need the standards, we need the data to actually move this field forward. So one can then take these signs as seen by these assessments, pair it with the patient-reported outcomes, and look towards outcome decisions that are going to matter for those patients. Accelerating data sharing, I can't overemphasize the power of this, and it's incredibly important to move this field forward. We're hoping to collaborate with the Collaboration for Alzheimer's Prevention. It's a real initiative where different companies are encouraged to share their data even prior to the final completion of the trial. And the regulators seem to be okay with that. So I think that's an important, if it's done properly. I'm going to skip this and just simply say there's a lot of data sources that one can go out there to find this information. Not always are you able to, because of the data collaboration agreement, to share it. In Europe, we hope to break into other efforts that are sponsored by the Innovative Medicines Initiative and hopefully tap into that, at least for Alzheimer's disease. And finally, I'll mention a paper that was recently published at the end of last year about this ecosystem and how one can pull things together. It applies not only for Alzheimer's per se, but I think it has implications across all of these different areas that we're critically involved in. And last but not least, the next frontier is really collecting that real-world evidence and integrating it into our understanding. So, and clearly Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy has been instrumental in moving this forward. So with that, I thank you for your attention and our members and contributors for enabling our work. Thanks.
Good morning. I have the last presentation between you and lunch, so I'll try to be brief and keep us on time. My name is Ken Skodacek. I work in the clinical trials program within FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I'm giving this talk on mobile health technologies because many people think that FDA might regulate these products in a way that limits their introduction and use within clinical research. I like to think of FDA as a proactive regulatory partner in helping organizations fulfill the appropriate regulatory requirements. We're doing everything possible to not be an obstacle to innovative products that are going to ultimately promote and protect the public health. If I had more time today, I'd talk to you about a lot of the other initiatives we have going on, but I'd like to give you a brief glimpse of things that we're doing at FDA. That includes work on patient-reported outcomes, so helping organizations and sponsors develop and use patient-reported outcomes in their clinical trials. Using patient preference information and gathering additional information from patients about what their preferences are in terms of the use of the device or use of drugs and other sort of aspects that help us, FDA, better understand the patient's preferences when we weigh in on our regulatory decisions. We held our first patient engagement advisory committee last fall. And the primary focus of that advisory committee meeting, which was mainly made up of advisory committee members that are representatives of patient organizations or actually patients with different diseases and conditions. And the primary focus of that advisory committee meeting was patient engagement in the design and conduct of clinical trials. So we're doing everything we can possible to consider the role of patients. We also have focus on real-world evidence, so we published a guidance last year explaining how we would use regulatory real-world evidence in our regulatory decision-making. We have things called the Experiential Learning Program. We actually get out of our offices in Silver Spring, Maryland, not too far away from here, and visit manufacturers, sponsors of clinical trials, contract research organizations, and IRBs to better understand how they interact with us and interact with the other stakeholders. And later this spring, there's actually an orthopedics workshop coming up that's focused on smart devices, so bringing smart technology and building those into orthopedic products and orthopedic implantable devices in a way that allows us to better understand how patients are performing. All right, so my colleagues up here on the stage talked a little bit about the digital health activities. There's a lot of different things going on within FDA. Back in the end of 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act was passed. It included specific legislation clarifying and amending the definition of a medical device to exclude certain software applications. There's also a digital health innovation action plan that you can read here on our website. And earlier in January, there was a workshop focused on software pre-certification pilot and trying to work with technology companies such that they can introduce their technologies and software in a more unique way, allowing us to regulate them differently. Of course, if you have to go through FDA for a clearance or approval, when you want to push an update to an app, that could be problematic. So we want to work with those manufacturers in a way that allows them to rapidly introduce and iterate on their technologies to improve the public health. So as my colleagues both included in their slides as well, there's a lot of information already out there, a lot of publications. I think we had the same publication from JAMA that we referenced that's already going on, so I won't go there too much here. I just want to emphasize it's not a matter of if these technologies are going to be used in the healthcare space or clinical research, but how. Next, I have a test for all of you. So I happened to be preparing a similar presentation a few years ago, and I happened to be reading a book and saw something on the Discovery Channel about the lacuna. How many of you know what a lacuna is? No, it's okay. Say some people. A lacuna is called a blind spot. It's another word for the blind spot. I'm going to put up a cross on here, and I want you to stare very closely at the cross as soon as it comes up. And again, don't lose focus, stare at the cross. So if you look very closely at the cross, the wording below it says, how will FDA regulate the technology? Unfortunately, when you're focused only on that sole question, you tend to overlook the other more important question, and is it how can I use the technology in the clinical trial? And why I want to use this sort of description of a blind spot is I think some people are so focused on FDA's regulation of the technologies that they overlook the potential benefits and how to use the technologies in clinical research. So that question is, will FDA regulate the technology as a medical device? The answer to any good question is, it depends. I'm going to read for you the definition of a medical device and then give you some insights. A medical device is a product that is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease that does not achieve its principal intended purposes by chemical action or by being metabolized. So basically, it's differentiating medical devices from the broad variety of other products and medical devices from pharmacological products like drugs who do interact through being metabolized. Simple medical products could be something as simple as an electronic thermometer. I have 2 children at home. My wife is always running around the house and measuring their temperature pretty continuously, especially when you just have to stick it on their forehead. It makes it a lot easier. To the more advanced products like electronic surgical devices. There are also other products that are used in the clinical research space that are regulated as medical products. So Stephen mentioned one from Proteus Health, this device that you put on a pill and you can basically swallow it and tell you whether or not the patient ingested the pill. And there are also devices that are, again, are medical products that are devices and cleared by FDA that measure activity sensors and everything else. I think I want to emphasize, too, though, that the reality is that the explosion in the use of this technology is a result of the use of these technologies in consumer products, right? Everyone here has a smartphone, and the computing power within your smartphone far exceeds the computers of generations past. And even when I went to the Toys R Us to try to see if they had any toys left on the shelf before they close, you could still see toys that have all kinds of different microprocessors and other cool things that are I would not have dreamed of having until I was in college, and now my son could have when he's the age of 5. So I want to talk to you about 3 different guidance documents that help you understand how FDA may or may not regulate products as medical devices. So the first is called the MDDS, or Medical Device Data Systems Guidance, and it's basically saying that if something is simply being used to transmit data or convert data or store data from one location to the next, that we do not intend to imply that that device would be regulated as a medical device. So you'll have regulatory discretion. You can use those products as you would. You don't have to register and list. The next, and I'd say the more important guidance, is something called the General Wellness Guidance. This was issued in July of 2016. And it relates to maintaining or encouraging general state of health or health activity. So things like Fitbits and activity sensors, Apple Watches, everything that you can imagine that's tracking your activities and your overall health, that we don't intend to regulate those products as medical devices. It really depends, though, at the end of the day, on the specific claims that you're being made. So manufacturers might manufacture one product and want to make certain claims and have that product regulated as a medical device, and they might make a very similar product that they want to market in a consumer way, and they don't make those same claims. So it's all about the claims you're making, not the product or how it's being used. And I'd also like to clarify, too, that it's not extended to devices that might present inherent risk to patients. So if you develop an app on your smartphone and it shines a light on your skin and helps you diagnose skin cancer, and the device probably doesn't work very well, and a patient with skin cancer might go untreated or might not seek the advice of a physician, that would present a risk that FDA would intervene and has intervened. There's also a guidance called the Mobile Medical App, or MMA guidance, that was issued in February of 2015. And it basically places all kinds of these different apps into one of 3 categories. And you think of those categories as a pyramid. And on the bottom of the pyramid are mobile apps, and these are most of the devices, or most of the apps that you have on your phone right now. Mobile apps that are not considered medical devices at all. Some sort of a tracking program for doing tasks, or an alarm clock, or something else. There are also apps that might technically meet the definition of a medical device. So if you would flip back a few slides and read the definition of medical device and then think about how that app is being used on your phone, you might think it meets the actual definition. But because of the low risk involved to patients in using that app, that we're not going to regulate those products as medical devices. And then the third category are the actual mobile medical apps. These are medical apps that are being used as a device that have certain specific claims that are either intended to promote or protect the public health. So the pyramid that I draw there is sort of not to scale. So almost all apps are going to be in the bottom category. A small subset of them are going to be in the middle category, and very, very few are going to be in the top category. And you can actually go to our website and see products that have been cleared by FDA as mobile medical apps to get a sense of what our regulatory barrier is, or our regulatory bar is. I also want to call out some examples from the mobile medical app guidance that are specific to clinical research that further clarify our position. So it gives an example here. This is an example from the guidance that if an entity is manufacturing a device that's a mobile medical app, that we're going to say basically we're not going to make them register and list. We're not going to regulate them as a medical device manufacturer if that product is going to be used simply in clinical research and is not going to be marketed as a product in the healthcare system. So again, if you're a company that wants to manufacture these types of devices and wants to use them in the clinical research space, that does not mean that FDA would regulate them. It actually means that FDA will not regulate you as a medical device manufacturer. There's also a question, or frequently asked question, in the mobile medical app guidance that talks about electronic methods of collecting data from patients, whether it's an patient reported outcome or e-consent, other sorts of things. We are also not regulating these as medical devices, although they may be subject to other regulations associated with clinical research, such as the investigational device exemption or investigational new drug and all the related regulations. So to think about it, I think it's easiest to think about what is your role and what is your goal. So you could be a manufacturer and you manufacture widgets. And whether or not you want those widgets to be a consumer product or a mobile or a medical device or a mobile medical device is entirely up to you in terms of the claims that you make and your interactions with FDA. So manufacturers have a decision to make there. And I used a watch here, but this could be any type of product. And then as a sponsor or investigator, you have also the same decision to make, whether or not you want to use a consumer product or a medical device within your clinical trial. It's entirely up to you, and you should carefully weigh the pros and cons of each choice. There are a number of regulations that I mentioned before. So I mentioned the IDE regulations, which is Part 812, but there's also informed consent, financial disclosure, IRBs, the IND regulations, and Part 11 that covers electronic data in clinical trials. So if you're going to use one of these devices in a clinical trial, you probably want to look at those regulations. And of course, there are benefits and risks associated with using the technology. I think you've heard from some of the other speakers this morning about some of the benefits in terms of having patients not have to return to the clinic, gathering a lot more robust, higher quality data that allows you to learn about patients and how they're performing. And there are, of course, risks as well, right? That somehow you can't sign in, that an update gets pushed to the app and it doesn't communicate with your system anymore. Maybe the activity sensor that you're using, the hardware has a difference between one model and another, and you don't know that when you implement it in your clinical trial. So in all cases, use of the technology in a clinical trial does not mean that FDA would regulate that product as a medical device. There are also a number of other relevant guidance documents. I've included a few here on this slide. I want to draw attention to the first one mainly, the Medical Device Development Tools, or MDDT. And basically, this is a way for developers of technologies, whether it's a patient-reported outcome or an activity sensor, to come to FDA and say, hey, I think my technology or what I'm doing here has value in the clinical research space, and I think many other people might be able to use this technology in their clinical studies, and I want you, FDA, to interact with us and give us some feedback to help develop that tool and to make it the highest quality possible. So we already have sponsors coming to us with technologies. And CDER, the Center for Drugs, also has a similar program called the Drug Development Tools, or the Clinical Outcome Assessment Group, and they typically consult with us when it includes a technology. And our mutual goal is, of course, the same. Is there's a tremendous amount of complexity associated with choosing the products that you're going to use during your clinical trial, how you're going to use those products, what data you're going to collect, how you're going to analyze the data. In all those cases, we, just like you, want to make sure that you maximize the quality, and that information will be reliable and potentially support a marketing application for a new drug or a new device. Of course, Ken, you said thanks for all these different guidance documents and different regulations. I'm now more confused than I was at the beginning of your presentation. That's okay. You have a lot of options. But at the end of the day, we have something called the pre-submission program. It basically allows you to come to FDA and ask your questions. There's no fees associated with it, so it's free of charge. And it can be either a face-to-face meeting, a teleconference, or you can get feedback in writing via email from FDA. And basically, you just have to explain what your goal is, provide a concise summary of what you're trying to do, include some specific questions, what you'd like FDA to answer, and again, no user fees, and we'll give you feedback within 75 days, usually less than that. And of course, if you open up that guidance and you look at that guidance document and you say, Ken, thanks, but I don't want to read 47 pages of how to communicate with FDA, one of our division directors has pointed out that we also have this link on our website. So if you click on the link, it brings you to an org chart that spells out the different areas of expertise within the center, and it provides email addresses, phone numbers, and names for each of the branch chiefs for the different product areas. And what I would recommend is using a very old piece of technology, your phone, and pick up the phone, call us, and have a conversation. We'd be more than happy to assist you and work through the process. That's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has a question, feel free to make your way to one of the mics in the middle of the room. Oh, we're going to have a little scuffle here in the back. We'll go with the front mic.
There you go. I represent a site network, and I'm wondering how do the sites embrace the use of these medical technologies? You talked briefly about how the patients perceive that. What about the sites? I've been doing research since 1989 when we actually did use paper diaries, NCR forms, circation report forms, and the yellow stickies. E-diaries are not very well received in some instances in trials, and sites have difficulty sometimes managing all the different vendors of all these different devices. Just wondering what your take on it. I'm a proponent of the devices. I think they're good. I wonder if there's any resistance from the site's perspective.
I'll just make a quick comment. I'm a pediatric oncologist, and we often have to roll out ways for patients and parents to give us data. And actually, the families are very happy about different ways to interact with the system. I think where the biggest challenge is actually, like you said, with the sites, because one of the big reasons these things fail, somebody dumps on them a technology and then there's no support. And so having a clear line of communication for what happens when the Fitbit won't connect anymore, what happens when the iPad, has an OS update and the questions don't look right anymore, that's the most important part. And that's nothing will get the study nurse to pull out the clipboard faster than just having 50 calls from patients who can't connect. So I agree, there has to be a clear line there of tech support.
Great. Yeah, so my question or comment was along those same lines. And the data is from the CTTI survey of patient preferences. So if I botch the statistics, let me know. But 85% of the patients, according to that survey, when they were presented with, would you do the one study with not a lot of wearables or the other study with a lot of wearables and less clinic visits? I think it was 85% said, oh yeah, I'll do the more wearables, less clinic visits and things like that. But then in other presentations I hear the studies about, well, the drop-off rate is no different than with regular apps. It's an logarithmic effect of, everyone's great first 30 days, just like my daughter who wanted the dog who's going to feed it and water it and change its water and play with it every day. After about 30 days, the drop-off is poor. So I'm curious if there's any more meta-analysis that can be done on the drop-off rate on that. And the second part is with the sites as well. Also along the same survey, the overwhelming majority of patients says they wanted the site to train them on the devices. And the overwhelming majority said they wanted the site to be the help desk for those devices. And not necessarily overwhelming, but the majority said they wanted to have the device supplied to them because they didn't want to bring their own device because they were concerned about their data, minutes, and utilization and additional costs to them. I would imagine if you ask the sites, 0% would say they want to be the help desk, 0% would say they want to train them, and 0% say that they would, or 100% would say they want the patients to bring their own devices so we don't have to archive, store, update, and all that kind of stuff. So how do we get past that disconnect?
So I don't interact a lot directly with sites at FDA, but I will say that I think I would pose the question differently, and I would pose the question is, why is clinical research the one place where we're sort of falling behind on how technology is being used, right? When you buy a house, I don't sign any papers manually anymore, right? You have this DocuSign system, and you're signing everything electronically. So most other consumer products and other areas where they're advancing are racing past clinical research, and I think what's going to happen slowly over time that it's going to increase the adoption of these technologies is people aren't going to remember how to sign things manually. Even at work, I don't sign anything manually anymore. And I think all those sorts of use of technology outside of the clinical research space is going to force clinical research to catch up, and it's going to force clinical researchers that don't have experience signing things or interacting with paper in a way to move forward.
I don't think it's a cultural thing. I think it's an implementation thing. I don't think that we're not used to signing things electronically.
Well,
Yeah,
we all need to change and learn.
Yeah, I mean, the mortgage company may do it, but at the bank, they have their one consent, or document or whatnot. They don't have racks of 100 of them from a variety of different people that are going that they have to keep updating all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, maybe we should change our consent
It's an
process.
implementation issue.
That's a good point. Let's put that number one on the list for transformation. Yeah.
I mean, I just make one quick comment that, just one of the things I see in the informatics industry is that people just try to computerize some manual process, thinking that's the best way to move forward, without rethinking the workflow. So and that's obviously, everybody's nodding their heads. That's obviously not what we need to do. Is just say, well, we did it on paper this way. Let's make an electronic version of that. And I think the more creative we are, the more forward-thinking you are about what is the data we're trying to get, what's the workflow. I think people will buy into it better.
I just want to make another general comment. We're worried about how, in terms of compliance, you have a wearable, are you wearing it, are you not wearing it? But one of the things that's happening to the field is there's the unobtrusive assessments. So there's more and more devices that are being placed in a home where actually you can start to monitor movement and other things where you don't have to wear the device. It sends out a signal, and it can actually measure things like respiration, heart rate, where you are in the home. I mean, so we're getting to the point where we're going to be very sophisticated in terms of the ability to assess what's happening to an individual. And so that's probably a next wave of activities where I don't think you have to worry so much about is the device easy to use? It'll basically be in the background, and you'll be able to collect information. So we're not quite there, but that technology is starting to become available.
And I would also argue, too, that I think the use of these technologies allows us to be a little bit more honest with ourselves about the limitations of prior technologies. So having a patient record a patient diary of their activities or their sleep, I mean, honestly, that is not reliable at all, but somehow it was the only thing that we had available to us for many years, and we trusted it. And I think the reality is we're going to find these newer technologies, measure information about patients, collect more reliable data, have information that we didn't have access to before, and make the outcomes that we gather from these trials much more significant and impactful.
Yeah, a really great series of talks, and especially appreciate the guidance. And if I'm understanding this correctly, because I think this would be helpful for everyone, it's not, the device is the background in some ways, right? So if you're saying something's going to measure heart rate, and then you just have to make sure it's reliably measuring that. And if it is, then that's data. And it's really how we use the data. So if we're thinking about patient-reported outcomes and we're thinking about quality of life, actually the device and how, whether you use it on paper, whether you use it on a device, or whether you use it, doesn't really matter. What matters is how you organize the information and put it in context, and that's actually what you want to see at the FDA. That's probably what we need to be thinking about in practice. Do I have that right? That it's the device, we should don't worry about the device. The device is an enabler.
Sure, I guess, I mean, you think about an example of a 6-minute walk test, right? We don't regulate the stopwatch. We don't regulate the chairs they sit in. We don't regulate the hall they walk in. But all of those things could actually have a potential impact, right? Like if you're walking in a hallway that has a heavy plush carpet, it's going to slow the patient down compared to a tiled hallway. If it's a nice plush chair that they sit in and it feels all comfortable versus a hard chair, they might sit there a little bit longer and get some rest. All those things can impact the results.
But maybe that's misplaced precision. And really what you want is the data, and we still have to think about how are we going to use the data and put it in context and use it to support or show that an intervention is effective or not. And that's really what we should be focusing on.
Right, it's what you're measuring versus how you're measuring it.
Exactly, and focus more on how we can create data that helps us move forward faster. Is that
well said?
okay?